Bloodthirsty neocon and head of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mike McCaul. I always confuse him with Mike McFall. They're basically the same person, so frankly, you can use their names interchangeably. He went to Kiev, I guess, along with Biden, and I missed this yesterday. Mike McCaul is someone who's usually more openly bombastic with the threats. He maybe has a little bit more of a measured tone than, let's say, a cowboy like Lindsey Graham. Even though, Lindsey is more of the Brokeback Mountain kind of cowboy, not really like the John Wayne kind of cowboy. Anyway, McCaul added fuel to the fire that I was sounding an alarm over yesterday. The potential for the U.S. to send F16s to Ukraine, which Zelensky was asking for before, and there was a lot of media reports about how, the U.S. was close to doing that, and then the administration ultimately came out and said, no, it's fake news. We're not planning on doing that, and the story died down for a little bit. Now, while McCaul did not use the term F-16, he did say that there's a growing consensus and that, we're moving towards, in Washington, we're moving in the direction of sending planes, and that in anticipation of that, the Ukrainians are going to start training pilots on likely the F-16 platform. And so yesterday, I had said that I didn't think that, because Ukrainian pilots are not trained on how to use the F-16, they likely would send these planes over, and then Ukraine would have to hire NATO contract soldiers or pilots to fly these missions, because Ukrainian pilots are not trained on the F-16. Perhaps they're going to tell us that the Ukrainians will somehow, I guess maybe they'll go on a trip to Poland, a bunch of them, and fly around in F-16s and get their little, get their Top Gun certification. And since they all are already pilots, maybe it wouldn't take them that long to familiarize themselves with the F-16. But I would think it would be tough, considering that the F-16, does not have any controls written in Cyrillic. And I'd imagine that's what they'd be used to. It's one thing if you have controls written in a different language. If I was a pilot and I got in a plane where all the controls and all the labels were in, Spanish or French, that might be a bit confusing, but, I can still read what the words are, and once I learn, what each word, the ones that aren't cognates, what they actually mean, then I could probably pretty comfortably fly a French-made airplane. But if I bought something like a MiG or an Su-24, which has Cyrillic writing, or I don't know, like a Japanese Zero, which would have Japanese writing, I'd be totally lost because it is a completely different writing system. But who am I? Let's put that aside. Let's just say, okay, Ukrainian pilots. Let's just assume that they learn how to fly F-16s, and they don't need any American or NATO contract pilots. And by that, I mean what yesterday I was referring to, not active duty NATO pilots, retired guys who know how to fly these planes, who will come in as contractors, Blackwater stuff. Or in the case of Ukraine, you have the Wagner Group. And those, of course, are Russian military contractors. But if there is no need for contract pilots, and native Ukrainian pilots are able to pilot the F-16 or any other American plane that is sent over, you would still need the American military infrastructure to maintain those planes. You would need parts and technicians from America to go over to Ukraine to be present at all the air bases to service these planes. And so what I see now when I look at the way the Ukraine conflict is evolving, it looks to me like the Biden administration is going to take this in the direction of Yemen. the way that the Yemen war was, and I think to a certain extent still is, fought was not with any American boots on the ground, so to speak. You didn't have Americans kicking in doors in Yemen. What you had were, and you didn't have any Americans making bombing runs. You had Saudi pilots in American planes, of course owned by the Saudis, but they were F16s or maybe even F-35s. I don't know if Saudi Arabia has F-35s. Probably not. But nonetheless, American planes, American bombs, American advisors, let's call them, picking out the targets, saying, hey, here's a grain silo. Go bomb this grain silo, and you will starve this entire village, and they will have to surrender. CIA guys saying, hey, here's where the water treatment facility is in this part of Yemen. Knock out that water treatment facility, and, they will have to surrender and beg you for fresh water, or else they'll die of cholera. Seems actually the latter is what ended up happening in Yemen. It had a massive multi-year cholera epidemic, killed untold thousands of people, mostly young children. And so anyone who's followed the Yemen campaign knows that it did not work out well. If you thought that the goal was actually to win a war, that never happened. All that happened was death, destruction, and lots and lots of money going to the American military-industrial complex, because you had to have, these Boeing contract mechanics flown over to Saudi Arabia, who were stationed at these Saudi bases, whose job it was to maintain, repair and replace parts on these aircraft, whether they be F-16s or 737s. And actually, I think the 737 tankers were not even the property of the Saudis, because if I remember correctly, they were actually the U.S. Air Force that was refueling, doing the mid-air refueling of the Saudi jets in the Yemen war. And so potentially we could see the same thing here in Ukraine, because I don't think that the Ukrainians have any planes that are capable of mid-air refueling for the F-16s, and certainly something like that I would think would take practice. It's probably not something that they would be able to train the Ukrainians to do in short order. But who knows? Maybe they'll just forego the whole mid-air refueling thing anyway. I don't know what the utility of it is. I just know that it's something that the Saudis engaged in the Yemen war, and that it was the U.S. that was actually providing the mid-air refueling. All the Saudis were doing were showing up, jumping in a plane, and actually pressing the button to drop the bombs. The Americans were picking the targets. The Americans were providing the jets. The Americans were providing the bombs. The Americans were, completely maintaining the jets and everything. But officially, this was a Saudi war because the pilots themselves were Arabs. So this dishonest model could be what they're going to implement in Ukraine. In which case, is that really any better than having American contractors? Because either way, the U.S. would say if they were American-born contractors flying these jets on behalf of Ukraine and bombing Russia inside of Russia. Remember, we're talking about inside of Russia's borders. Victoria Nuland has opened the door to that. She said that the U.S. supports bombing Crimea. Russia considers Crimea to be a part of Russia's sovereign territory, and so that the line has been crossed. The U.S. may as well be bombing. I don't know what's a Russian city near the Ukraine border. I can't remember any of them now. But anyway, I said yesterday, if there were American contractors flying these, and dropping these bombs, Putin would see that, rightfully, as America bombing Russia directly. And I don't think that it'll be any different if you have, again, just like with the Yemen war, America providing everything and doing everything, carrying out the mission, but putting in the case of Yemen, an Arabian pilot in the cockpit, or in the case of Ukraine, a Ukrainian pilot in the cockpit. I don't think that changes, everything else. That doesn't override the fact that the Americans are providing the planes, the Americans are providing the the bombs, the Americans at that point likely will be picking the targets if they haven't been already. And I tend to believe that the U.S. military and the CIA are deeply involved with the day-to-day prosecution of this war. And so I want to revise what I said yesterday, take what I have learned since and integrate it and still say that my point stands. Russia will rightfully see this as America bombing Russia inside of Russia's borders, and I don't want to see how the Russians will react to that. You know, the hawks love to say, "Oh, let's see what they do, huh?" You know, Putin's not man enough. You know, I'm not interested in challenging Putin's manhood. It's just that's not something that gets me out of bed in the morning. Because you know what? You poke a bear, you keep poking the bear, one of these days it's going to wake up. And so, like Reagan and Carter and Ford and Jack Kennedy and just about every president of the Cold War era, everyone that I can think of, was not worth trying to push the Ruskies to the brink of nuclear war. Frankly, if we were in the Cold War, I mean, this is all way worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. You realize that, folks? Because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, all the Ruskies were doing was arming Cuba with the implication that one day Cuba might go to war with the United States, and if they do, well, hey, look, they've got nukes. And while thankfully we have not sent nuclear weapons to Ukraine, so I guess you could say it's not that bad, Ukraine is actually at war with Russia. Imagine if Cuba and the United States were in a shooting war, a hot war, and the Ruskies came in and gave the Cubans a blank check and did everything but actually put Russian soldiers on the front lines in Cuba fighting American soldiers. But they were Cuban soldiers armed with Russian guns, flying Russian planes, taking orders from KGB operatives who were controlling the tactical and strategic decisions. Imagine if the Russians were running a war right on America's borders, completely commanding a puppet state like Cuba. You think the United States, you think Jack Kennedy would have blinked over that? No. The answer is no. And so I don't think Putin would either. I can hope that he would. I hope that under no circumstances, even if you have U.S. troops on the ground and they march all the way to Moscow and they're banging down the doors to the Kremlin and they're ready to string up Vladimir Putin, I hope that Putin is such a pussy that he won't push the button even then, that he never launches nuclear weapons. I hope that that's the case. But I'm not going to take that chance. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.